In this video, we're going to have a look at creating a virtual network. So we're going to have a look at setting up some of the individual components. So first of all, we're going to create the virtual network itself. Then we're going to create two subnets within that virtual network. We're going to add NSG to each of the subnets, which is a network security group. And then we're going to look at adding a virtual machine within this subnet and making port 80 and port 3389 for remote desktop available through the NSG for machines within this subnet. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a resource group. A resource group is just a container where we can group together related Azure resources. And in this resource group, we're going to place any resources related to network resources. So we're just going to name it appropriately so we can easily identify what's within the resource group. So it's a resource group for the test environment, and the resources we're going to place in it is network related resources. So we're going to create this resource group. So now the resource group has been created and we have currently no resources within it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a virtual network. So to set up the virtual network, we're going to select the resource group that we just created in the previous screen and a name for our virtual network. So it's for the test environment, and we're just going to call it VNet 01 and put it into the North Europe region. Then when we navigate to IP addresses, we can see that it's added a default address space for us, so 10.0.0/16. And the /16 indicates that we have a possible over 65,000 IP addresses available within that address space for us. So we can change that. We could say, for example, use an address space of /24, and that would give us a possible 256, I think, addresses. It's advised to make sure you allow enough space for future growth when deciding on the size of the IP of the address space that you're allocating to the virtual network, because as soon as you start adding resources into your virtual network, you can't change the address space after the fact. So it's really worth spending time considering what size of an address space you want to use. So the subnet here, it's added a default subnet for us. So we're just going to remove that subnet, and we're going to create a couple of separate subnets. So we're going to create two subnets. The first is going to be a subnet where we're going to place virtual machines to host our applications. So the first subnet is going to be for application resources. We're going to create a subnet address range of 10.0.0/28. So we're going to have 11 IPs plus 5 Azure reserved. So we'll have the possibility of having 11 resources within this particular subnet. So we'll create this, and we'll add a second subnet, and this is going to be for our databases, and we'll give that a range of 10.0.0.16/28. So we're going to take the next block of IPs and we'll assign it to the SQL subnet. I'm going to create that. So now we have two subnets within this address space. We can continue to add subnets to reserve them for future use, but it is advised that you leave some empty subnets that you can use for perhaps in the future you'd want to add an Azure resource such as a managed SQL, which requires an empty subnet, or deploying an ASE, application service environment, which requires an empty subnet. So we'll go ahead and create the virtual network with the subnets. So a virtual network has been created, and we can have a look at the resource. We've got no connected devices at the moment into our virtual network. If we go to address space, we'll just see the address space we gave it, and into subnets, we can see that we have the two subnets that we set up. We can add further subnets by clicking here and adding in additional subnets within the range that we have created. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a virtual machine and place it inside the app subnet. And after that, then we're going to create a network security group to create rules and allow access to that virtual machine. We're going to create a virtual machine. We're going to create a new resource group on the test environment, but _app. So any of our application Azure resources we're going to place in this resource group as opposed to the network resource group. It's just to try and keep them in a structured way. I'm just going to call the virtual machine VM app01 in the North Europe region. Just pick a small basic size of the VM. And see here for public inbound ports, we're not going to use any of the pre-selected. We could select that we want to give access on port 80 or RDP and 3389, but we want to do this ourselves just to familiarize ourselves with the process on adding NSG rules later on. So we're going to select no public inbound ports there. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to leave the disks at the default. And then under the networking tab, we are going to select our virtual network that we created in step 1. So we're going to place this virtual machine inside the VNet01 virtual network. And we're going to place it inside the app subnet. So we want this machine to reside within that subnet, which is a subnet, just a grouping of, it'll allow us to assign network rules to a group of Azure resources. And we do want to put a public IP on this virtual machine because we're going to remote onto it after we add network rules later. We're not going to give any access here at this stage either because we want to give this access at a later stage. So go next. Don't want boot diagnostics. And we leave everything else as default, and we just review and create this virtual machine. So we click create. Our virtual machine has been created, and if we just have a look in the resource group for the application resources, we can see what it's created. So it's created the virtual machine with an IP because we specified we wanted a public IP for this virtual machine. And it's also created a network security group and a network interface for that virtual machine and a disk. So first off, what we want to do is we want to remote onto this virtual machine because we want to install IIS in order to, so we can deploy a web application, for example. We're not going to do that, but we want to, so if we have a look in on the virtual machine, it gives us the public IP that it's applied to that machine. But if we try and remote onto it currently, it's not going to allow us because we didn't enable the port to give us remote desktop access when we were setting up the virtual machine. So what we want to do is we want to add a rule into this NSG on the virtual machine itself. So after this, we're going to create an NSG for the subnet. But the sequence that it goes in is it's going to process the rules at a subnet level first, and then it will, if there's any NSG rules on the resource itself, so in this case on this VM, if we have rules on the resource itself, it will process those after the subnet rules. So if we navigate into the network security group, we will see that there are some default inbound and outbound security rules already set up, and this is associated with a network interface. So it's associated with the network interface for the virtual machine. So if we come down to inbound security rules, we're going to add a new rule that will allow us access to remote desktop onto this virtual machine. So we're going to set it up, source and destination. We're going to leave it any for the purpose of this. It's just a demo. You wouldn't necessarily expose your virtual machines to allow remote desktop publicly. You'd normally have it behind a VPN or some other secure access. But just for the purpose of the demo, we're going to allow access on port 3389, which is the remote desktop port. And just add a name and a description, and we're going to add that rule. So we can see it's added the rule, and it's got a warning sign on it because basically we've exposed the port to be available publicly on the internet. And the priority is 100, so it does it in sequence. So it'll do this rule first and then proceed. So now that we've added a rule saying that we want to allow access on this network security group, which is tied to our virtual machine, we should be able to remote desktop onto the public IP that was available. So this time we get a credential pop-up. So the port has been opened. So we're going to just log in. I have just enabled this virtual IIS on this virtual machine so that we have a landing page that we were going to try and navigate to. So if we try and browse to the public IP, we'll see that we don't have access to that page, and that's because we didn't give access on port 80 when we were setting up the virtual machine. So now what we want to do is, instead of just giving access to this virtual machine on the network security group that we just did for remote desktop, we want to apply a rule at the subnet level. So any virtual machine that goes within this application into this subnet will inherit the rule to give access on port 80. So we're going to create a new network security group. We're going to place it inside the resource group that we created earlier on for RSG test environment for the network resources. We're just going to name this network security group NSG, and it's for the app resources, and place it in the North Europe region. So we're going to go ahead and just create that network security group. Our network security group has been created, so we are going to create a new rule similar to what we did to allow access for the remote desktop, but this time we're going to allow access for port 80. We're going to just leave it fairly generic. I'm going to add. The next thing we want to do is we want to associate this network security group that we've just created with our subnet that we created earlier on. And we can do that from either from the network security group or from within the subnet. Seeing as we're in the screen, we'll just navigate to the subnets, and we'll see that it's not associated with any subnet currently. So we're going to just click associate, and we're going to select our virtual network, and we want to associate it with the app subnet, and we'll click OK. So that just means that any of the rules that we create on this network security group are going to be assigned to this subnet, and any resources within that subnet will inherit those rules. If we have a look at the rules attached to the virtual machine, we'll see that the virtual machine has the network security group that's attached to the subnet, plus the network security group that we created on the network interface itself. So the sequence that they're processed in is, first of all, it'll process the subnet rules, and we have access allowed to port 80. However, then it'll process the rules attached to the NSG on the network interface, and we've only allowed access to port 3389. So the rule that was created here is overridden by the rules on the network interface itself, so access will be denied. So what we need to do in this case is we need to add the port 80 rule onto the security group on the virtual machine. So we shall add another rule here, and just leave it at port 80, and add. Now we'll see that we have access to port 80 on the virtual machine. So hopefully this video just gives you an understanding about creating virtual networks and subnets and network security groups, and how it ties together. Because when you're creating a virtual machine through the Azure portal, you can do a lot of that stuff just from selecting default options, and it'll just create them for you. So it's just always good to have a bit of an understanding as to what exactly each individual component is doing. Hope it helps.